The Forbidden City, a sprawling labyrinth of vermilion walls and gilded roofs, pulsed with the unseen machinery of an empire. Within its formidable confines, amidst the silk-clad concubines, the stoic ministers, and the all-powerful Son of Heaven, existed a peculiar class, the eunuchs. From their earliest appearance in the Western Zhou dynasty to their pervasive influence in the Qing, eunuchs were an intrinsic, often sinister, part of the imperial apparatus. More than mere servants, they were the silent witnesses, the unseen hands, and sometimes the true power behind the dragon throne. But beneath the veneer of ornate robes and whispered commands lay a reality far grimmer than any outsider could imagine. A life forged in unimaginable sacrifice, perpetual scrutiny, and a chilling proximity to ultimate power. Their stories were not of glory, but of a grotesque transformation, a life forever altered, beginning with a singular, irreversible act. The question of why this brutal practice of castration became the cornerstone of imperial service for eunuchs is a complex one, rooted in a potent mix of practical concerns, social anxieties, and the very structure of the Chinese imperial household. It was not a random act of cruelty, but a calculated measure designed to maintain the emperor's absolute authority and the sanctity of the imperial line. The emperor's lineage was considered divine, and the succession had to be beyond any doubt. The palace was a vast ecosystem, housing hundreds, even thousands, of concubines, empresses, and female attendants. Uncastrated men, even servants, living in such close proximity to the imperial harem presented an unbearable risk. The fear of illicit affairs, of a commoner's child being mistakenly identified as an imperial heir, was a constant nightmare for emperors. Castration was the ultimate, albeit barbaric, solution to eliminate this threat, ensuring that only the emperor could father children within the palace walls. The imperial harem was a fiercely competitive environment. Concubines vied for the emperor's attention, not only for personal favor, but also to secure their own positions and, crucially, to produce an heir. Allowing virile men into this space would introduce an intolerable element of competition for the women's affections, potentially undermining the emperor's unique status and control over his consorts. Eunuchs, being physically incapable of romantic or sexual relationships, removed this layer of rivalry, allowing them to serve the female inhabitants of the palace without becoming rivals to the emperor. Uncastrated men had families, wives, and children, creating external loyalties and potential conflicts of interest. Their primary allegiances would naturally lie with their own kin. Eunuchs, by contrast, were often from impoverished families who willingly sent them to the palace in hopes of a better life. Once castrated, they were effectively cut off from their family lineage and the traditional path of continuing the family name. This severance was seen as forging a unique and absolute loyalty to the emperor. Their entire existence, their wealth, their power, and their very survival depended entirely on the imperial household. They had no lineage to pass on, no independent power base to build outside the palace, making them singularly focused on serving the emperor and the imperial system. The most intimate parts of the palace, the emperor's private chambers, the women's living quarters, the imperial kitchens, and bathhouses, were forbidden to uncastrated men. These were realms of absolute privacy and vulnerability for the imperial family. Eunuchs, by virtue of their altered state, were deemed safe to enter these sensitive areas. This granted them unparalleled access and intimacy with the imperial family, allowing them to perform personal services that no other male official could, from dressing the emperor to tending to the empress. This proximity often translated into immense influence, as they became confidants and trusted agents. The very existence of eunuchs served as a stark and powerful symbol of the emperor's absolute, unquestionable authority. The emperor possessed the power to demand such a profound and irreversible sacrifice from his subjects. It demonstrated that no individual's body or destiny was truly their own in the face of imperial will. This act of disfigurement, endured by thousands over centuries, reinforced the hierarchical order and the omnipotence of the Son of Heaven. While eunuchs sometimes adopted sons, they could not produce their own biological heirs. This meant that any power or wealth accumulated by a eunuch during his service would not naturally pass down a family line, preventing the establishment of hereditary aristocratic families within the bureaucracy that could rival the imperial house. It ensured that high positions attained by eunuchs were, in theory, always temporary and ultimately revertible to the imperial authority, preventing the formation of powerful, entrenched bureaucratic dynasties. The necessity of castration was not merely a cruel tradition. It was a deeply embedded aspect of imperial governance, a foundational pillar designed to protect the emperor's lineage, secure his personal domain, and consolidate his absolute power. The eunuchs, physically incomplete but often politically formidable, were the living embodiment of this chilling calculation, their very bodies a testament to the supreme demands of the dragon throne. Here are the top 10 horrifying facts about eunuchs. 1. The Forbidden City, a sprawling labyrinth of vermilion walls and gilded roofs, pulsed with the unseen machinery of an empire. Within its formidable confines, amidst the silk-clad concubines, the stoic ministers, and the all-powerful Son of Heaven, existed a peculiar class, the eunuchs. From their earliest appearance in the Western Zhou dynasty to their pervasive influence in the Qin, eunuchs were an intrinsic, often sinister, part of the imperial apparatus. More than mere servants, they were the silent witnesses, the unseen hands, and sometimes the true power behind the dragon throne. But beneath the veneer of ornate robes and whispered commands lay a reality far grimmer than any outsider could imagine. A life forged in unimaginable sacrifice, perpetual scrutiny, and a chilling proximity to ultimate power. Their stories were not of glory, but of a grotesque transformation, a life forever altered, beginning with a singular, irreversible act, often performed on a child. Imagine a small, vulnerable hand, not yet calloused by labor, clutching a single copper coin. For many impoverished families across imperial China, this meager sum was the only payment a child would bring home after being taken to the dreaded, stinking quarters, the colloquial term for the grim, unsanitary chambers where the act of castration took place. These were not willing adults making a grand sacrifice. These were often boys as young as 5 or 6, sometimes even younger, whose fates were decided by desperate parents seeking to escape the clutches of famine, debt, or social stagnation. The hope, however faint, was that one day, their emasculated son might rise within the imperial bureaucracy, bringing wealth and status back to the family. But for the child, the journey began not with hope, but with unimaginable terror and excruciating pain, often culminating in a silent, lonely death. The procedure itself was a brutal, unsophisticated affair, far removed from any medical understanding of anatomy or hygiene. It was less a surgical operation and more a ritualistic mutilation, steeped in superstition and indifference to human suffering. The setting. The castration chambers were usually dark, damp, and unsanitary. There were no sterile environments, no antiseptics beyond perhaps a crude wash of pepper water or alum. The air hung heavy with the stench of human waste, fear, and dried blood from previous victims. The surgeons, the operators, were rarely trained physicians. Often, they were older eunuchs themselves or individuals who had learned the grisly trade through apprenticeship. Their knowledge was empirical, based on generations of practice, but devoid of any scientific understanding of preventing infection or managing pain. Preparation. The young boy would be forcibly restrained, often tied to a wooden board or held down by several strong men. There was no anesthesia beyond perhaps a swig of opium or alcohol, which would only dull the senses slightly, not eradicate the agonizing pain. The area to be excised would be washed with hot pepper water, a painful disinfectant, though it also numbed the nerves to a very limited degree and induced swelling, ostensibly to make the parts easier to grasp. The cut. The primary tools were typically a sharp, curved knife, sometimes specifically designed for the task, or even a razor. With swift, brutal strokes, the penis and testicles were severed at the root. The entire process was designed for speed, not precision or comfort. The sheer agony of this moment, the severing of one's very core, would induce shock in many. The screams of the children were said to haunt the stinking quarters for years, controlling the bleeding. Hemorrhage was one of the immediate and most common killers. After the cut, the wound would be packed tightly with paper soaked in oil, herbs, or even ashes. A hollow quill or straw might be inserted into the urethra to prevent it from closing and allowing urine to pass. The boy would then be forced to walk around, sometimes for hours, to prevent the blood from clotting internally, an excruciating ordeal that only exacerbated the pain and shock. The preservation of the precious pouch. In a morbid ritual, the severed parts were carefully collected, often preserved in lime or oil, and kept in a sealed jar. This precious pouch, or bow, was of immense significance. It was believed that without it, the eunuch could not be a complete man in the afterlife. More practically, it was also his proof of status. A eunuch would often need to present his pouch upon retirement or even death to confirm his identity and allow him to be buried in a family tomb. This grim artifact highlighted the profound, irreversible nature of their transformation. The act of castration was merely the beginning of the ordeal. The subsequent days and weeks were a perilous journey through infection, pain, and psychological torment, with death lurking at every turn. Infection, the silent killer. Without sterile tools, antibiotics, which wouldn't be discovered for centuries, or proper wound care, infection was rampant. The open wound, exposed to unsanitary conditions, would frequently become inflamed, leading to fever, sepsis, and organ failure. Many boys would succumb to gangrene, their bodies slowly poisoned by the spreading infection, hemorrhage, and shock. While immediate bleeding was addressed, internal hemorrhages could occur days later, particularly if the boy exerted himself or the crude dressings failed. The extreme trauma and blood loss also induced deep shock, which could overwhelm the body systems and lead to collapse and death. Urethral complications. The insertion of the quill or straw was meant to keep the urethra open, but it often caused further irritation, infection, or blockage. If the urethra is scarred over or became too narrow, the boy would be unable to urinate, leading to a painful buildup of toxins, kidney failure, and slow, agonizing death. Many eunuchs suffered from lifelong urinary incontinence or difficulties due to complications from their castration. Psychological trauma. Beyond the physical agony, the psychological trauma inflicted upon these young boys was immense. They were stripped of their masculinity, their future as a father, and their place in the traditional family structure. This profound identity crisis, coupled with the constant physical pain and the brutal environment of the palace, often led to emotional numbness, deep depression, or outbursts of unpredictable behavior in later life. The survival rate. Historical accounts vary, but it's widely accepted that the death rate from castration was horrifyingly high. Some estimates suggest that as many as 1 in 3 boys did not survive the immediate procedure or the critical weeks following it. For every eunuch who survived to serve in the Forbidden City, there were likely several who perished silently, their young lives extinguished before they could even begin. Their bodies were often unceremoniously disposed of, their sacrifice unmourned outside their immediate, often distant, families. The stinking quarters were not just a place of physical mutilation, they were a threshold of death. For the countless young boys who passed through them, their journey into Imperial service was a gamble with the highest stakes imaginable, their very lives. The agonizing pain of the blade, the relentless march of infection, and the profound trauma of their transformation left an indelible mark, not just on their bodies, but on their souls. The eunuchs who survived carried this brutal legacy, their existence a testament to the chilling lengths to which imperial power and societal desperation could drive human beings. 2. The initial agony of the blade, the searing pain of the pepper water, and the terror of the immediate aftermath were only the first horrors in the making of a eunuch. For the young boys who survived, another, more subtle, yet profoundly disturbing layer of their transformation awaited: the preservation of the very body parts that marked their former masculinity. This wasn't merely a grim custom. It was a practice steeped in spiritual belief, practical necessity, and a twisted form of identity. Once the brutal act of castration was complete and the bleeding somewhat staunched, the excised penis and testicles were meticulously collected. These weren't simply discarded. Instead, they became the precious pouch, known by various terms, often bao or inbao. The sight of these severed organs, still warm with the life just drained from them, being carefully handled and prepared, must have been a chilling spectacle for the bewildered child, if he was still conscious enough to witness it. The preservation process. The method of preservation varied, but it often involved drying the organs, perhaps smoking them or immersing them in lime, camphor, or various oils and herbs. This was done to prevent decomposition and allow for long-term storage. Once prepared, they were carefully placed in a small, often ornate, lacquered box or jar. This container then became the eunuch's most guarded possession, a symbol of completeness in the afterlife. The primary belief behind this practice was deeply rooted in traditional Chinese cosmology and the concept of the afterlife. It was believed that to be whole and pass peacefully into the next existence, a person needed all their bodily components. Without their removed genitalia, a eunuch was considered incomplete, a ghost or demon in the afterlife, unable to perform ancestral rites or join his ancestors. The precious pouch was, therefore, his ticket to spiritual integrity, a physical assurance that he would be whole again in the next world, proof of status and entry to society. Beyond the spiritual, the precious pouch served a crucial practical purpose. In a society obsessed with lineage and identity, the severed parts were tangible proof that a man had indeed undergone castration and was therefore a true eunuch. This proof was vital for several reasons. Entering service. While the initial entry into the stinking quarters was often chaotic, formal employment within the palace, especially in more sensitive roles, sometimes required the presentation of the bao as verification of their eunuch status. Retirement and burial. When a eunuch retired from service or upon his death, it was a macabre form of identification, confirming his status even in death. Protection against impersonation. In a complex bureaucracy, verifying identities was crucial. The bao prevented uncastrated men from falsely claiming eunuch status to gain access to the palace's inner sanctums or specific privileges. For the eunuch himself, the precious pouch was a constant, tangible reminder of his ultimate sacrifice and his altered state. It was a source of both existential dread and profound security. It represented the brutal act that had defined his life, yet also the key to his spiritual peace and social acceptance. This morbid relic underscored the unique and tragic existence of the imperial eunuch. His body was not entirely his own. A part of it, detached yet eternally connected, lived on in a jar, serving as a testament to the supreme demands of the empire and the depths of human desperation and resilience. 3. The liminal existence, neither man nor woman, beyond the physical scarring and the morbid preservation of their lost parts. The most profound and enduring consequence of castration for a eunuch was the indelible alteration of their identity. Stripped of their masculinity, yet never truly becoming women, eunuchs occupied a perplexing and often painful liminal space in Chinese society. They were an anomalous third gender, living in a constant state of not belonging. The social and biological dichotomy. In imperial China, gender roles were rigidly defined. A man was expected to marry, procreate, and carry on the family lineage, upholding filial piety and ancestral worship. A woman's role was primarily domestic, focused on bearing children and managing the household. Eunuchs fit into neither category. Denied masculinity. From a biological standpoint, their inability to father children was the most glaring absence. This directly contravened the core purpose of a man in Chinese society. They were often referred to with derogatory terms that highlighted their incompleteness, such as rootless trees or dead branches. Their voices often remained high-pitched. Their bodies sometimes developed a softer, more rounded appearance due to hormonal changes, further distancing them from the societal ideal of male physique. Not embraced as feminine. Despite often working in traditionally female spaces like the Imperial harem and attending to the emperor's consorts, eunuchs were never considered women. They could not bear children, nor did they partake in the social and domestic roles assigned to women. Their social standing, while often low, was distinct from that of women, who were generally subservient to men, where you are constantly reminded of your incompleteness. Many eunuchs developed complex coping mechanisms. Some became ruthless and ambitious, seeking power as a substitute for their lost masculinity. Others retreated into quiet servitude. Still others formed strong, often codependent bonds with fellow eunuchs, creating surrogate families within the palace walls. This ambiguous status had profound implications for their daily lives and societal interactions. Exclusion from traditional life. They could not participate in the rites and rituals reserved for men, such as ancestral worship within their own families, which was a cornerstone of Chinese culture. They were often viewed with suspicion and mockery by the general populace, who saw them as unnatural or even grotesque. Unique access, unique peril. Paradoxically, their ambiguous gender granted them unique access. As the only males permitted in the innermost sanctums of the palace, they became indispensable intermediaries between the emperor and his harem, and often between the imperial family and the outside world. This intimacy, however, also placed them in a precarious position, as they were often privy to highly sensitive information and became easy targets for political intrigue or imperial wrath. A third gender, hierarchy, within the eunuch community itself. A complex hierarchy and distinct social norms emerged. Older, more powerful eunuchs often took younger ones under their wing, forming master-apprentice relationships that mimicked familial bonds. They developed their own customs, language nuances, and a strong sense of collective identity born from shared trauma and shared experiences. This internal cohesion was a crucial survival mechanism in a world that largely rejected them. The eunuch's life was a testament to a profound human adaptation to an unbearable condition. They were neither male nor female, but something else entirely, a product of imperial necessity and a chilling example of the lengths to which individuals were pushed by fate and power. Their lives were a continuous negotiation of identity in a world that offered them no easy classification, leaving them forever suspended between two predefined halves of humanity. 4. The peculiar transformation. A body reimagined. The agony of castration and the profound psychological burden of a liminal identity were compounded by the bizarre physical transformations that many eunuchs underwent. Stripped of their primary source of testosterone from a young age, their bodies deviated significantly from the typical male form, often leading to appearances that blurred traditional gender lines and, tragically, to severe psychological distress. The absence of testosterone, a lifelong alteration. Testosterone, the primary male sex hormone, plays a crucial role in the development of secondary sexual characteristics during puberty and throughout adulthood. When a boy was castrated before or during puberty, the loss of this vital hormone had profound and lasting effects on his physiology. Voice changes. Without the surge of testosterone that deepens the voice, many eunuchs retained a higher-pitched, often reedy or girlish voice well into adulthood. This distinctive vocal quality immediately marked them as eunuchs and further emphasized their otherness. Body hair suppression. The growth of facial hair, beards, and mustaches, and body hair was significantly stunted or entirely absent. This left their skin unnaturally smooth for adult males. Another visual cue of their altered state. Altered skeletal development. Testosterone contributes to the closing of epiphyseal plates, growth plates, and bones. Without it, the long bones might continue to grow for a longer period, sometimes resulting in disproportionately long limbs. Conversely, muscle development was often inhibited, leading to a less muscular and more slender physique. Fat distribution. The body's fat distribution patterns also changed. Instead of the typical male pattern of fat accumulation around the abdomen, some eunuchs developed more subcutaneous fat, leading to softer, rounder contours, particularly around the hips and breasts, giving them a more feminine appearance. This could range from subtle changes to noticeable breast development, known as gynecomastia. Skin and hair texture. Their skin often remains softer, almost childlike, and their hair could be finer and less prone to male pattern baldness. These physical manifestations were not just cosmetic, they were a constant, visible reminder of their castration and their inability to conform to societal expectations of masculinity. The scars within, psychological and gender dysregulation. The peculiar physical changes, combined with the profound trauma of their early lives and their ambiguous social status, often led to deep-seated psychological disturbances. Identity crisis and gender dysphoria. Imagine growing up in a body that doesn't align with your perceived gender, or one that is neither fully male nor female. For some eunuchs, this created a profound identity crisis or even a form of gender dysphoria, a distress caused by the mismatch between one's biological sex and one's gender identity. They were forced to inhabit a body that did not fit traditional classifications, leading to confusion, self-loathing, or an inability to reconcile their inner sense of self with their outer appearance. Emotional instability and depression. The constant awareness of their mutilation, the social stigma, and the daily reminders of what they had lost contributed to widespread emotional instability. Depression was likely common, manifesting as apathy, withdrawal, or chronic sadness. The lack of hormonal balance could also play a role in mood regulation, potentially exacerbating these issues. Unpredictable behavior and cruelty. For some, the psychological distress manifested in unpredictable or even cruel behavior, lacking the traditional outlets for male aggression or ambition, and having suffered immense pain and humiliation. Some eunuchs became notoriously vengeful, manipulative, or tyrannical, particularly when they gained power. Their actions could be seen as a twisted form of compensation or a projection of their internal suffering onto others. The palace, with its cutthroat politics, often provided a fertile ground for such behaviors to flourish. Sexual confusion or reorientation. While physically incapable of reproduction, the complex interplay of human sexuality meant that some eunuchs might still experience forms of libido or attraction, albeit without a traditional outlet. This could lead to intense frustration, confusion, or the development of non-normative sexual behaviors or identities within the confines of the palace. Historical accounts sometimes hint at homosexual relationships among eunuchs, or between eunuchs and palace women, as a means of seeking emotional and physical intimacy in their altered state. The bizarre physical transformations and the resulting psychological torment underscore the immense human cost of the eunuch system. They were not merely servants. They were individuals whose very bodies and minds were reshaped by the dictates of power, leaving them in a perpetual state of otherness, navigating a world that offered no easy place for their peculiar existence. 5. Can die at any time. Despite their proximity to the emperor and the immense power some eunuchs wielded, their lives were perpetually precarious, hanging by the thinnest of threads. Unlike official bureaucrats who enjoyed a degree of legal protection and defined ranks, Eunuchs often existed in a legal limbo. They were subject to the emperor's whim and the shifting tides of court politics, meaning that even a minor misstep could lead to a swift and brutal execution. The absence of legal safeguards. Imperial China operated under a complex legal system, but eunuchs frequently fell outside its conventional protections. No official legal status. Eunuchs did not possess the formal legal standing of officials, who had prescribed ranks, defined duties, and established procedures for disciplinary action. Their position was often more akin to personal servants, albeit highly powerful ones. This lack of official legal definition meant they were largely at the mercy of their masters. Direct imperial authority. For eunuchs, the emperor's word was often the only law. They reported directly to him or to powerful members of the imperial family, bypassing many layers of the formal bureaucracy. While this granted them direct access and influence, it also exposed them to the full, unchecked force of imperial wrath. There were no appeals, no trials, often not even an explanation, when the emperor's displeasure turned deadly. Fatal missteps, the price of proximity. Life in the Forbidden City was a minefield of unspoken rules, intense scrutiny, and dangerous rivalries. Even seemingly trivial errors could be interpreted as insubordination, incompetence, or even treason, especially when fueled by paranoia or the machinations of rivals. Breaking a jade cup. The example of breaking a jade cup perfectly illustrates the fragility of a eunuch's existence. Such an incident, seemingly a mere accident, could be twisted into a grave offense. It might be seen as disrespect, carelessness, or even an omen. In a court steeped in superstition and rigid protocol, even minor physical damage to imperial property could be interpreted as a personal slight against the emperor himself, particularly if he was in a foul mood or seeking an excuse to punish someone. Misspoken words to a concubine. The imperial harem was a dangerous arena, rife with jealousy, ambition, and suspicion. A eunuch's role often involved intimate contact with concubines and empresses, managing their daily lives and relaying messages. A casual remark, a misinterpreted glance, or an accidental slight to a powerful concubine could be maliciously reported to the emperor. Given the emperor's possessiveness over his women and the concubine's own desperation for favor, a eunuch could easily become a pawn or a victim in their intricate power struggles, leading to accusations that resulted in immediate execution. Walking at the wrong hour. The Forbidden City operated on a strict timetable. Specific gates were opened and closed at certain hours, and movement within different sections of the palace was highly regulated. Being found in the wrong place at the wrong time, even due to a simple mistake or misunderstanding, could be construed as spying, plotting, or illicit activity. Such a transgression could immediately raise imperial suspicion and result in summary punishment, often death. Falling out of favor beyond specific transgressions. The most common cause of a eunuch's demise was simply falling out of imperial favor. Emperors were notoriously fickle. A eunuch who was once a trusted confidant could suddenly be seen as too powerful, too arrogant, or merely inconvenient. Rivals, both eunuchs and officials, would constantly look for opportunities to undermine each other, and a lapse in the emperor's goodwill was often all it took for a eunuch to be purged. The lives of eunuchs, despite their power, were lived under a constant, palpable fear. Every word, every gesture, every movement was scrutinized. Their proximity to the ultimate power was a double-edged sword. It granted them immense influence, but also placed them directly in the crosshairs of an unpredictable and absolute authority. The chilling reality was that, for a eunuch, life could end abruptly and arbitrarily, their existence extinguished by a whim, a rumor, or a shattered jade cup. 6. Used, discarded, and forgotten, the tragic twilight. The life of a eunuch, even for those who attained immense power, was often a cycle of intense utility followed by brutal abandonment. While young, capable eunuchs might bask in the emperor's favor, serving as indispensable eyes, ears, and hands within the palace. Their twilight years were frequently marked by profound loneliness, destitution, and a tragic anonymity. The very system that elevated them could, and often did, cast them aside when their usefulness waned. The peril of age and fading favor. The imperial court was a ruthless arena where only the fittest or most cunning survived. As eunuchs aged, their physical vigor diminished, their connections might weaken, and their ability to actively serve the emperor might decline. This made them vulnerable. Loss of direct access. The emperor's favor was often fleeting, easily shifting to younger, more energetic, or more charismatic eunuchs. As an older eunuch's direct access to the emperor dwindled, so too did his influence and perceived value. The new favorites would then consolidate power, often at the expense of the old guard, especially if their contributions no longer justified their upkeep. Emperors, or more often, the powerful eunuchs in charge of personnel, would constantly assess the court's efficiency. Political purges, periods of political upheaval, or the ascension of a new emperor often led to large-scale purges. Old eunuchs, particularly those associated with the previous reign or who had accumulated too much power, were prime targets. They were seen as liabilities or potential threats, making their forced retirement, or even execution, a convenient way to consolidate new power. The harsh reality of retirement. When a eunuch was retired, it rarely meant a comfortable pension existence. For many, it was a death sentence in slow motion. Expulsion from the palace. Eunuchs were literally expelled from the only home many had ever known. The forbidden city, their universe for decades, suddenly became an impenetrable barrier. They were cast out into a world they barely understood, often with little preparation or resources. Poverty and destitution. Despite the vast wealth that some high-ranking eunuchs accumulated, many rank-and-file eunuchs earned meager wages. After decades of service, they might have little to no savings. Cast out from the palace, they faced immediate destitution. They lacked marketable skills for life outside the imperial system, making finding work incredibly difficult in a society that already viewed them with suspicion. No family, no support. The most tragic aspect of a eunuch's old age was their utter isolation. Cut off from their birth families, who often didn't want them back, seeing them as a burden or a source of shame, and unable to form their own families, they were fundamentally alone. The surrogate families they formed within the palace often dissolved upon retirement, as each individual struggled for their own survival, dying in obscurity. The common fate for many discarded eunuchs was to live as beggars, wanderers, or to find refuge in small, impoverished temples or eunuch-specific charities, if any existed. Their end was often lonely and unmourned. Many died solitary deaths on the streets, their bodies perhaps collected by charity workers or simply left to decay, a stark contrast to the opulence they once served. There was no grand funeral, no ancestral shrine, no one to remember their service or their sacrifice. The life of an imperial eunuch, therefore, became a cruel paradox. They devoted their entire being, their very essence, to the imperial family. They lived in the heart of power, witnessed history unfold, and sometimes even shaped it. Yet, for many, this intense proximity to greatness ended in profound isolation, poverty, and a quiet, forgotten death, underscoring the ultimate disposable nature of their existence in the rigid hierarchy of imperial China. 7. The King's Underground. While many eunuchs faced lives of quiet servitude and tragic ends, history also records a chilling counter-narrative. The rise of exceptionally ambitious and cunning eunuchs who, through masterful manipulation and sheer ruthlessness, managed to seize an astonishing degree of power, effectively controlling emperors and manipulating the entire imperial court. Figures like Wei Zhongxian, Ming Dynasty, and Li Lianing, Qing Dynasty, stand as stark reminders of how an unbridled thirst for power, combined with their unique position, could destabilize an empire. The path to absolute influence. How did these seemingly powerless figures achieve such dominion? Proximate access to the emperor. This was their greatest asset. Eunuchs were constantly by the emperor's side, attending to his personal needs, managing his daily schedule, and controlling who had access to him. They became privy to his private thoughts, his weaknesses, and state secrets. This intimate connection allowed them to subtly influence imperial decisions, relay selective information, and even forge imperial edicts. Controlling information flow. A key tactic for powerful eunuchs was to act as gatekeepers of information. They could filter messages, intercept petitions, and decide which officials would gain an audience with the emperor. By controlling what the emperor saw and heard, they could shape his perception of reality, elevate their allies, and demonize their enemies. Building personal factions. Eunuchs like Wei Zhongxian built vast networks of loyal followers within the bureaucracy and even the military. They promoted their sycophants to key positions, creating a parallel power structure that bypassed traditional official channels. These loyalists, often corrupted by the eunuch's patronage, would blindly enforce their master's will, exploiting weak or child emperors. The periods of greatest eunuch power often coincided with weak, young, or ineffective emperors who preferred personal pleasures over governance. These emperors became puppets, easily manipulated by their trusted eunuch attendants who effectively ran the country in their stead. The reign of terror and imperial decline. When eunuchs gained unchecked power, the consequences for the empire were often catastrophic. Purging loyal officials to consolidate their control. Powerful eunuchs systematically purged loyal and upright officials who dared to oppose them. Wei Zhongxian, for instance, instigated brutal inquisitions and executions against the Donglin faction, scholar officials who advocated for good governance. These purges eliminated capable administrators, leaving the court riddled with corruption and incompetence. Rampant corruption and extortion. With their hands on the levers of power, these eunuch tyrants amassed enormous personal fortunes through bribery, extortion, and embezzlement. They sold official positions, levied illegal taxes, and plundered state coffers, severely weakening the imperial treasury and burdening the common people. Military weakness, neglecting defense in favor of personal enrichment. These eunuchs often oversaw a decline in military readiness. Funds intended for the army were diverted, competent generals were sidelined or eliminated, and the borders became vulnerable. This contributed to internal rebellions and external invasions, pushing the empire towards collapse. Societal decay. Their influence often led to a general breakdown of law and order, a decline in moral standards at court, and widespread social unrest. The rule of law was replaced by the rule of personal whim, eroding public trust in the imperial government. The violent end, a fate of public scorn. However, the wheel of fortune turned. The power of these eunuch despots, built on manipulation and terror, was inherently unstable. Their downfall was often as dramatic and brutal as their rise. Loss of imperial favor. The ultimate undoing for a powerful eunuch was always the loss of imperial favor, often upon the death of their patron emperor or the ascension of a new, stronger ruler determined to reclaim authority. Rebellion by officials. Once their protector was gone, the long-suffering scholar officials, military commanders, or even rival factions within the court would seize the opportunity to strike. They would rally against the eunuch's tyranny, presenting a united front to the new emperor. Brutal executions. The punishments meted out to fallen eunuch tyrants were exceptionally cruel, reflecting the profound public hatred they had accumulated. Wei Zhongxian, after his downfall, was stripped of his titles and forced to commit suicide, but his body was later dismembered. Li Lianing, though his end is debated, faced widespread condemnation. Accounts describe their bodies being desecrated, with eyes gouged out and corpses burned by angry mobs or imperial decree. A symbolic act of utterly erasing their existence and purging their corrupting influence from the realm. This public display of vengeance served as a stark warning against unchecked power and the ultimate price of tyranny. The stories of eunuchs who seize control are a dark testament to the seductive nature of power and the unique, perilous position they occupied within the imperial system. They were both victims and perpetrators, their tragic origins often fueling a ruthless ambition that, in turn, wrought havoc upon the very empire they served. 8. A childhood stolen, the inescapable fate. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of the eunuch system was not the physical agony or the political machinations, but the utter absence of choice for those who entered it. The vast majority of eunuchs were not volunteers who made a conscious decision to sacrifice their masculinity for power. Instead, their lives were irrevocably decided for them as mere children, often through brutal coercion or the desperate actions of their own families. The economic imperative. Poverty as the driving force. For countless impoverished families across Imperial China, the sale of a child, even a son, into castration was a horrifying but seemingly unavoidable last resort against the crushing weight of destitution, famine, and debt. Frequent famines, natural disasters, and crippling debts often pushed families to the brink of starvation. A desperate parent, seeing no other way to feed their remaining children or settle in insurmountable debt, might view the sale of a son into eunuch service as a stark choice between one child's suffering and the survival of the entire family. The lure of opportunity, while grim, the palace offered a perverse form of opportunity. A eunuch, if he survived and thrived, could accumulate wealth, connections, and even power that would be utterly unattainable for a commoner from poor background. This distant, unlikely dream, however twisted, was sometimes enough to justify the unspeakable act in the eyes of desperate parents. They hoped their child's sacrifice would lift the family out of misery. A gift to the empire, in some cases, particularly during periods of imperial demand for eunuchs. Families might offer a son to the court as a gift or a form of tribute, hoping to gain favor or avoid harsher consequences. Abduction and trafficking, children as commodities. Even more horrifying than family sales were the cases of abduction and forced castration, kidnapping for profit. Criminal gangs specialized in kidnapping young boys, particularly from vulnerable rural areas or during times of unrest. These boys would then be forcibly castrated in clandestine, brutal operations, often resulting in high mortality rates, sold into the palace. The surviving children, traumatized and mutilated, were then sold into the palace as a commodity. They were literally trafficked human beings, stripped of their identity and autonomy before they even understood what those concepts meant. Their value lay solely in their ability to serve within the imperial household in their altered state. No recourse. For these children, there was no escape, no recourse, and no hope of reclaiming their former lives. They were severed not only from their bodies, but from their families and any semblance of a normal childhood. A life decided, not chosen. The profound injustice of the eunuch system lies in this fundamental truth. The individuals who served as eunuchs were almost always victims of circumstance, their lives predetermined from infancy. They were not given a choice. Loss of autonomy. Their childhoods were stolen, replaced by the trauma of castration and the harsh realities of palace servitude. They were denied the fundamental human right to self-determination, their destiny molded by the external forces of poverty, power, or violence. Psychological scars. This involuntary entry left deep, enduring psychological scars. Imagine living a life that was fundamentally not your own, a path forced upon you before you could even speak for yourself. This contributed to the complex mental and emotional states observed in many eunuchs, from deep-seated resentment to a desperate clinging to any form of control or power they could grasp. The imperial eunuch, therefore, stands as a poignant symbol of human cost in the pursuit of absolute power and stability. Their existence was a testament to the brutal realities of a society where the lives of the most vulnerable could be sacrificed for the grand machinery of empire. their childhoods ending not with play, but with the chilling snip of a blade and a fate they never chose. 9. Living a lie and plotting. For any eunuch who survived the initial trauma of castration and the perilous journey into palace service, a new, equally brutal challenge awaited. Navigating the labyrinthine world of the Imperial court. This was not a place of open loyalty or straightforward merit. It was a den of vipers. A treacherous environment where survival hinged on cunning, manipulation, and an unwavering willingness to engage in the darkest forms of intrigue. To endure, many eunuchs had to shed any semblance of innocence and embrace a life of constant deceit and backstabbing. The constant threat of the palace. The imperial court was a pressure cooker of ambition, jealousy, and paranoia. Every individual, from the emperor to the lowest maid, was constantly vying for favor, protection, or power. For eunuchs, who lacked traditional family backing and formal legal protection, the stakes were even higher. Scarcity of resources and favor. Access to the emperor, specific duties, better living quarters, and wealth were all finite resources. This scarcity fueled intense competition among eunuchs themselves and between eunuchs and other court factions, such as scholar officials or imperial relatives. The emperor's capriciousness. As we've discussed, the emperor's favor was fleeting. A trusted confidant one day could be a banished outcast the next. This inherent instability meant that eunuchs lived in perpetual fear of falling out of grace, driving them to extreme measures to maintain their position. Whispers and accusations. The court thrived on rumor and innuendo. A casual remark could be twisted into a malicious accusation, a minor error exaggerated into a grave offense. Eunuchs were masters at planting seeds of doubt, spreading false information, and orchestrating accidents for their rivals. The arts of survival, flattery, factionalism, and betrayal. To survive and thrive in this cutthroat environment, eunuchs developed a refined set of skills centered on self-preservation, often at the expense of others. Mastering flattery and servility. The most basic survival tactic was to become an expert in flattery and sycophancy. Eunuchs learned to anticipate the emperor's moods, cater to his every whim, and constantly affirm his divine authority. They were skilled at delivering news selectively, highlighting what would please the emperor and concealing what might displease him. For concubines and empresses, they became indispensable attendants, always ready to serve, listen, and subtly influence. Forging alliances and factions. No eunuch could survive alone. They formed complex factions and alliances, often based on shared regional origins, patronage from a powerful senior eunuch, or mutual interests. These alliances provided a degree of protection and a network for information gathering and resource sharing. However, these alliances were often temporary, and shifting loyalties were common. The art of backstabbing. Betrayal was an inherent part of court life. To rise, or simply to survive, many eunuchs had to be willing to stab each other in the back. This could involve planting incriminating evidence, fabricating accusations, exposing a rival's secrets, or subtly poisoning the emperor's mind against them. The goal was to eliminate competition and secure their own position, no matter the human cost, orchestrating downfalls and harm. For those seeking true power, the stakes were even higher. Powerful eunuchs were known to actively harm or even arrange the deaths of officials, concubines, or even other eunuchs who stood in their way. This could involve direct assassination, poisoning, or, more commonly, orchestrating false charges that led to a brutal execution approved by the emperor. The justice system itself could be manipulated to serve their ends. Being silenced, the ultimate consequence. The phrase, "whoever is not cunning enough will eventually be silenced," perfectly encapsulates the eunuch's reality. Silenced could mean anything from banishment and ruin to literal death. Those who were naive, honest to a fault, or simply failed to grasp the intricate rules of palace intrigue were swiftly eliminated. Their lack of guile made them vulnerable, and the unforgiving nature of the court ensured their quick demise. The psychological toll of living in such a state of constant paranoia and moral compromise must have been immense. Many eunuchs became cynical, ruthless, and emotionally hardened. Their humanity sacrificed on the altar of survival and ambition within the gilded cage of the Forbidden City. Their lives were a chilling testament to the corrupting influence of absolute power and the desperate measures individuals would take to endure in a system designed to strip them of everything. 10. An undignified end. The unmourned and unhallowed death. The tragic trajectory of a eunuch's life often culminated in an equally grim end. A death devoid of dignity, marked by anonymity and neglect. Even for those who achieved immense power or served faith. Only for decades, the deep-seated societal disdain and their unique status meant that a proper burial, a revered ancestral shrine, or even a simple remembrance was often denied to them. Their bodies, like their lives, were often discarded and forgotten. The eunuch graveyard, a place of discarded souls. For the vast majority of eunuchs, even those who survived to old age, their ultimate resting place was rarely a hallowed family plot. No ancestral worship. The core purpose of a man in traditional Chinese society was to continue the family lineage and perform ancestral rites. Eunuchs, being castrated, could do neither. This meant EY were fundamentally cut off from their own ancestral lines. Their families, if they even acknowledged them, would often not permit their burial in the family cemetery, as they were seen as a disrupt. Ion to the lineage's purity, the eunuch's mass burial ground. Consequently, many eunuchs were interred in designated, often unmarked, burial sites. These were grim, desolate plots, sometimes referred to as eunuch's mass burial. Grounds, Taikangizuka, Oaru, Moa Kuruduri, Yunachi, Dumping Grounds, by THA Taijiamu. These were not places of honor or respect, but rather dumping sites for bodies that society deemed unworthy of probe. Or interment. They were places where the cast-off were simply laid to rest, often in shallow graves, without ceremony. No incense, no prayers. The absence of family meant the absence of ancestral worship. No one would burn incense for them. No one would sweep their graves, and no one would offer prayers for their peak. Ethel passage into the afterlife. Their spiritual well-being, which was so crucial to their early preservation of the precious pouch, was ultimately neglected in death. They were condemned to wander, as hungry ghosts, unremembered and unappeased. Disposal and obliteration, the fate of the disgraced. For eunuchs involved in court intrigues, or who fell dramatically from power, their deaths were even more horrific, designed not just to end their lives, but to utterly erase their existence. Disposing of the body. When a eunuch was implicated in a major plot, treason, or fell victim to a political purge, his death was often accompanied by the disposal of the body, Faitang Zak. This was not a proper burial, but an act of obliteration. The body might be secretly buried in an unmarked grave, dumped in a well, thrown into a river, or even cremated to prevent any trace of them remaining. Nove, erasing the legacy. This act of physical obliteration was a symbolic gesture to erase their legacy and any memory of their influence. It was a final, emphatic statement that their life and any power they once held was utterly nullified by the imperial will. This was particularly true for powerful eunuchs who had terrorized the court. Their physical erasure was meant to cleanse the empire of they. Our corrupting presence, public humiliation. In some extreme cases, especially for notorious figures like Wei Zhongxian, their bodies were subjected to public humiliation, dismemberment, or mutilation even after death, often by angry mobs or by imperial decree. This served as a chilling public spectacle, a warning to others, and a venting of public rage against their abuses. The imperial eunuch's journey from stolen childhood to a life of forced service, manipulation, and sometimes immense power often ended in the most desolate manner possible. Their unique role born. of sacrifice culminated in a death that mirrored their life's fundamental incompleteness. Unhallowed, unmourned, and ultimately, largely forgotten by the annals of official history. Their tragic ends stand as a final testament to the brutal, dehumanizing demands of absolute imperial power.